In the cold, vast wilderness of North America, what would later be known as Canada, the echoes of revolution stirred the hearts of many who once called themselves loyal subjects of the British Crown as the American Revolution erupted in the late 18th century. A great migration began, one not of choice but of principle. Thousands of Loyalists individuals who opposed the rebellion and remained faithful to King George III fled the 13 colonies seeking safety in the remaining British territories to the north. These Loyalists braved forests, rivers, and unfamiliar terrain in hopes of forging a new beginning in Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and the vast reaches of Quebec. Their arrival was not merely a demographic shift. It was the foundation of English-speaking Canada. The Crown rewarded their loyalty with land. But survival in this harsh land demanded more than allegiance. It required perseverance and community building. The Loyalists built homes, tilled fields, and formed the bedrock of new settlements. They brought with them British institutions, customs, and governance, a rigid yet familiar framework that would shape early Canadian society. However, the Loyalists were not alone. French settlers known as Canadians had already cultivated lives in the region. They spoke a different language, practiced a different faith, and harbored a distinct cultural identity. The coexistence of these two peoples would come to define Canada's evolving sense of self. Though the Loyalists sought stability, their presence deepened the tensions between French and English communities, particularly in Quebec, where cultural friction and conflicting legal traditions simmered beneath the surface. The British government, in an effort to maintain order and appease its subjects, enacted the Constitutional Act, which divided Quebec into Upper and Lower Canada. This was more than geographic partition. It institutionalized linguistic, religious, and cultural division in Upper Canada. English common law and Protestant institutions prevailed in Lower Canada. French civil law and Catholic traditions remained protected. While the act was intended to preserve peace, it set the stage for the complex political negotiations that would define the Canadian identity for generations to come. The early 19th century witnessed the rise of reformist voices in both Upper and Lower Canada, a younger generation educated, restless, and inspired by the revolutions in France and America, began to challenge the oligarchic rule of colonial elites in Upper Canada, the Family Compact. A small, powerful group of aristocrats held sway over land grants, the judiciary, and governance in Lower Canada. A similar clique known as the Chateau clique controlled the reins of power. Frustration mounted as calls for responsible government were met with indifference or repression. Simmering discontent eventually boiled over into open rebellion. In 1837, the rebellions of Upper and Lower Canada marked the first real test of colonial authority in the British North American provinces. Though both uprisings were swiftly crushed, they were not in vain. Their impact reverberated through the corridors of power in London, prompting the British government to dispatch Lord Durham to investigate the causes of unrest. His report would become one of the most consequential documents in Canadian history. Durham's report recommended responsible government and the unification of Upper and Lower Canada to foster assimilation and efficiency. While his ideas were not immediately enacted, they sparked a dialogue about governance, autonomy, and identity in the colonies. The British response to the Durham Report was the Act of Union in 1841, which merged Upper and Lower Canada into a single political entity, the Province of Canada, with the aim of creating a unified and manageable administration. Yet rather than silencing cultural conflict, the Union forced it into the open. English and French politicians now had to work together, often grudgingly, to govern a shared territory. Language, religion, and political ideology clashed daily in the chambers of the new legislature, yet amidst the discord, seeds of collaboration began to sprout. Leaders emerged who recognized the necessity of compromise and coexistence in order to achieve progress. The concept of responsible government slowly gained traction, culminating in 1848, when the British finally granted the province of Canada the right to self-govern under its own elected assembly. This pivotal moment marked the transition from colonial dependency to semi-autonomous rule and sowed the seeds of Canadian democracy. It was a fragile balance forged in the crucible of cultural conflict and political evolution, but it laid the groundwork for the nation Canada would one day become. As the mid-19th century unfolded, the province of Canada found itself facing new and complex challenges. Regional disparities, economic instability, and external threats stirred debates about the future of the colony in the eastern provinces. Nova Scotia and New Brunswick concerns grew about the vulnerability of their ports and borders. While in the Western Territories, fears of American expansionism loomed large, particularly after the annexation of Texas and the Civil War tensions in the United States, reminded British North Americans of their fragile autonomy and the looming danger of being absorbed by a growing republic to the south. Against this backdrop, political leaders from across the colonies began to consider an audacious solution, uniting the disparate provinces of British North America into a single federation. This idea, once considered radical, gained momentum as the benefits of shared defense, trade, and infrastructure became apparent in 1864. Representatives from the province of Canada, Nova Scotia, and New Brunswick convened in Charlottetown. To discuss the possibility of union, the Charlottetown Conference was intended to address maritime concerns, but soon transformed into a wider conversation about Confederation under the leadership of visionaries such as John A. Macdonald, George Etienne Cartier, George Brown, and Charles Tupper. The idea of a united dominion began to take shape. Their vision was not without resistance. Concerns over language, cultural preservation, and provincial autonomy echoed in the halls of debate, particularly among French Canadians who feared being swallowed by an English majority. Yet through negotiation and compromise, a framework emerged that sought to balance unity with diversity. In 1867, the British North America Act was passed by. The British Parliament and the Dominion of Canada was born, composed of Ontario, Quebec, Nova Scotia, and New Brunswick. The new nation retained ties to Britain but gained control over its internal affairs. This moment was not merely a political event. It was a foundational shift in Canadian identity. The fledgling country faced immediate tests: how to govern a vast and varied land, how to integrate indigenous territories, how to expand without igniting internal division. Macdonald, Canada's first Prime Minister, pushed aggressively for westward expansion, championing the construction of a transcontinental railway to bind the country together. The Canadian Pacific Railway was both a symbol and a tool of nation-building, linking the Atlantic to the Pacific and opening the western provinces to settlement and commerce. But this ambitious vision came at great cost. Indigenous communities were displaced, treaties were often ignored or coerced, and a new chapter of cultural suppression began. Through residential schools, forced relocation, and broken promises, the government pursued policies that sought to assimilate rather than respect Indigenous identity. The consequences of these actions would echo painfully through generations even. As the nation expanded, tensions continued to simmer within Confederation. The entry of Manitoba in 1870 and British Columbia in 1871 added to the complexity of governance. The diverse interests of the provinces challenged the federal government's authority and forced a delicate balancing act between regional identity and national unity. As the 20th century approached, Canada found itself grappling with questions of belonging and loyalty. Its status as a dominion meant that while it had domestic control, foreign affairs and ultimate legal authority still resided with Britain. During the Boer War in South Africa, Canada was asked to contribute troops, sparking a fierce debate about its obligations and its independence. English Canadians often leaned toward imperial solidarity, while French Canadians, led by figures like Henri Bourassa, advocated for a distinct Canadian identity, untethered from British wars and ambitions. The emergence of a dual national consciousness, one rooted in British heritage and another in a distinct Canadian ethos, began to define the country's internal discourse. As global tensions escalated, Canada's place in the world continued to evolve. The outbreak of the First World War would provide both a crucible of identity and a stage for asserting autonomy. Canada entered the war as a dominion but emerged with a newfound sense of nationhood. Its soldiers fought valiantly at Vimy Ridge, earning international recognition. and national pride, the war effort galvanized a generation and planted the seeds of sovereignty. Yet it also deepened internal divisions. The imposition of conscription in 1917 reignited tensions between English and French Canadians and laid bare the fragile unity of the young nation. As the war ended, Canada's contributions earned it a seat at the Paris Peace Conference and a signature on the Treaty of Versailles. For the first time, Canada acted independently on the world stage. This symbolic recognition of autonomy foreshadowed a larger transformation that would unfold in the decades to come. The journey from loyalists seeking refuge to liberals envisioning self-governance was far from over, but with each step, Canada grew more confident in its voice and more defined in its values, its identity forged in hardship, compromise, and the courage to question would soon demand a final break from colonial ties and a full embrace of nationhood. The interwar years brought both promise and peril to the growing dominion of Canada after the recognition it received. Following the First World War, the country experienced a surge in national pride and political confidence. Yet beneath this newfound autonomy, tensions remained. Economic disparity, regional isolation, and cultural rifts continued to challenge the young nation as the Great Depression swept across the world. In the 1930s, it struck Canada with particular cruelty. Unemployment soared, banks failed, and the government struggled. To provide relief, the western provinces, especially Saskatchewan and Alberta, suffered devastating droughts and economic collapse, leading to feelings of alienation and resentment against the federal government. This dissatisfaction gave rise to new political movements such as the Cooperative Commonwealth Federation and the Social Credit Party, signaling a desire for radical change and a shift away from traditional British models of governance, while economic struggles dominated the national stage. Political debates about autonomy continued to intensify. The Statute of Westminster, passed in 1931, marked a significant step in Canada's journey to independence. By granting full legislative equality with Britain, the statute recognized Canada as a self-governing entity capable of making its own laws without British interference. Although some constitutional ties still remained, this legislation represented a crucial affirmation of Canada's sovereignty. The Second World War once again tested Canada's unity and identity, but unlike the First World War, Canada entered the conflict as an autonomous nation, making its own declaration of war in 1939. This act symbolized a maturity and independence that had long been in the making. Throughout the war, Canadian forces earned global respect, participating in major campaigns from the Battle of the Atlantic to the D-Day landings at Juno Beach. At home, the war effort unified Canadians in purpose, but also exposed fractures, particularly over conscription. Once again, French Canadians resisted compulsory military service, believing their interests were being subordinated to British priorities, while English Canadians largely supported it. The government's decision to hold a national plebiscite in 1942 on the issue highlighted the enduring divide, but Prime Minister William Lyon Mackenzie King managed to navigate the crisis with careful compromise, preserving national unity even amid dissent. When the war ended, Canada emerged not only victorious, but transformed economically. Industrial production had surged, and the country had begun to shift from an agricultural to an industrial economy. Socially, the war had accelerated the integration of women into the workforce and prompted early conversations about civil rights. Politically, Canada assumed a greater role in global affairs, joining the United Nations as a founding member and participating in the formation of NATO. These actions further distinguished Canada as an independent actor on the world stage in the post-war period. The push for full independence gained new urgency. The limitations of Canada's constitutional arrangement became more apparent, especially in areas of judicial review and constitutional amendment. Though the Statute of Westminster had granted legal autonomy, it did not transfer the power to amend the Canadian Constitution, which still resided in the British Parliament. The desire to sever this final colonial tether grew stronger, as Canada sought to define itself not just in relation to Britain, but on its own terms. This period also witnessed the rise of a unique Canadian culture bolstered by the growth of national institutions. Like the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation and the National Film Board, literature, art, and music began to reflect Canadian landscapes, stories, and struggles, challenging the dominance of British and American cultural exports. Bilingualism and biculturalism became central themes in national policy with the Royal Commission on Bilingualism and Biculturalism in the 1960s. Acknowledging the need to recognize the dual heritage of the country, these developments were not without conflict as Quebec entered a period of rapid modernization known as the Quiet Revolution. Secularization, social reform, and economic empowerment reshaped the province and fueled a growing sense of nationalism. The rise of the Parti Québécois and its push for sovereignty underscored the fragility of Canadian unity. The rest of Canada responded with attempts to embrace and accommodate Quebec's unique identity. Prime Minister Pierre Elliott Trudeau, a staunch federalist and passionate defender of Canadian unity, introduced policies to promote bilingualism and multiculturalism and envisioned a country united not by sameness but by shared values of freedom, equality, and diversity. His charisma and vision galvanized many Canadians, but also drew criticism from those who felt marginalized or threatened by a strong central government. The challenge was immense: how to build a nation that respected its differences while maintaining cohesion. The answer would come in the form of constitutional reform, a bold attempt to finally patriate the Constitution and enshrine Canadian values in a charter of rights and freedoms. As the 1980s dawned, Canada stood at a critical crossroads. Its national spirit had matured through war progress and policy, yet its foundational legal document remained under the control of the British Parliament. This contradiction fueled one of the most important efforts in Canadian history. The patriation of the Constitution. At the center of this movement was Prime Minister Pierre Elliott Trudeau, who believed that Canada must define itself on its own terms through a Made in Canada Constitution. Central to this effort was the creation of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which would guarantee fundamental rights and liberties to all Canadians regardless of province, language, or culture. Trudeau's vision was bold. He sought not only to bring the Constitution home, but to redefine what it meant to be Canadian. The negotiations were complex and fraught with tension. Provincial premiers were wary of losing authority, and Quebec in particular demanded recognition as a distinct society that deserved special constitutional status. After months of intense debate and political brinkmanship, a breakthrough came during the so-called Kitchen Accord. In a late-night meeting, Federal Justice Minister Jean Chrétien, Ontario's Roy McMurtry, and Saskatchewan's Roy Romanow crafted a compromise that would win the support of most provinces. This last-minute deal excluded Quebec and sowed seeds of resentment that would echo for decades, but it also paved the way for a defining moment in national history. In 1982, the Canada Act passed in the British Parliament and was signed into law by Queen Elizabeth II in a rain-soaked ceremony in Ottawa. Trudeau triumphantly declared the birth of a fully sovereign Canada. The new constitution included the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, a powerful document that elevated individual liberty, dignity, and equality as national ideals. The charter became a living symbol of Canada's commitment to human rights, shaping the country's legal landscape and cultural identity, from freedom of expression to minority language, education rights. The charter transformed the way Canadians saw themselves and each other. This legal revolution also inspired social progress. The charter was invoked in landmark Supreme Court cases that struck down discriminatory laws and expanded protections for women, Indigenous peoples, and the LGBTQ community. It catalyzed a new era of civil empowerment and challenged institutions to uphold the values it enshrined. Yet the triumph of patriation was not without cost. Quebec's exclusion from the constitutional agreement deepened its estrangement from the federal system. The failure of subsequent efforts such as the Meech Lake Accord and the Charlottetown Accord to bring Quebec into the constitutional fold only exacerbated tensions. These failed accords exposed deep divisions not only between Quebec and the rest of Canada, But among provinces, regions, and cultural communities across the country, the national unity crisis reached its peak in 1995 when Quebec held its second referendum on sovereignty. The campaign was fiercely contested and deeply emotional. For millions, the question of whether Quebec should become an independent country was not merely political, it was existential. The vote was decided by the narrowest of margins. 50.6% voted to remain in Canada, while 49.4% voted to secede. The result was a collective sigh of relief, but also a sobering reminder of how fragile the Canadian Federation remained in the aftermath of the referendum. Efforts were redoubled to address regional grievances and promote a more inclusive national identity policies, promoting bilingualism, Indigenous reconciliation, and multicultural representation gained momentum. Immigration transformed the demographic landscape of major cities, and Canada increasingly embraced its identity as a mosaic rather than a melting pot. The legal, political, and cultural evolution of the country reflected a deeper truth. Canada's journey to independence was not a singular event, but a series of transformations driven by struggle, vision, and compromise. The rise of liberal ideals had redefined governance. Power was no longer concentrated in imperial hands, but distributed through a democratic federation guided by rights, accountability, and pluralism. Canadians had learned to navigate their differences not by erasing them, but by building bridges across them. Each moment of crisis had yielded a new consensus, and each debate had enriched the national story. By the end of the 20th century, Canada stood not only as a sovereign state, but as a nation shaped by its people's enduring pursuit of justice, equality, and peace. As Canada stepped into the 21st century, it carried with it the weight of a complex and hard-won independence. The journey from Loyalists, who had once fled revolution, to liberals who had redefined sovereignty, was not marked by a single event, but by a collection of struggles, debates, and reconciliations that continued to shape the country's evolving identity. The new millennium brought new challenges and opportunities. Globalization, environmental crises, technological revolutions, and the rise of populist movements across the world tested the resilience of Canada's democratic institutions and the strength of its federal system. Yet amid these changes, the country continued to hold firm to the principles that had guided its transformation from colony to nation. The Charter of Rights and Freedoms remained a cornerstone of Canadian life, shaping court decisions, political discourse, and cultural values. With each passing year, Canada expanded its understanding of rights and equality, embracing same-sex marriage, advancing gender equity, and confronting systemic racism through public inquiry and policy reform. One of the most profound reckonings of the modern era came with the growing awareness and acknowledgement of the historic injustices faced by Indigenous peoples across the country. From the residential school system to land dispossession, the painful legacy of colonialism came to the forefront of national consciousness. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission, established in the early 2010s, laid bare the extent of these atrocities through survivor testimonies, historical documentation, and emotional appeals. It offered 94 calls to action, challenging every sector of society to participate in a new relationship based on respect, recognition, and restitution. Reconciliation became a defining theme of modern Canadian identity. Yet it was not without controversy and conflict. The path toward healing demanded not only symbolic gestures but systemic change. Land acknowledgements, treaty rights, economic inclusion, and cultural revitalization were among the urgent matters on the national agenda. Governments struggled at times to keep pace with the demands for justice, but the conversation had irrevocably shifted. Canada was no longer content to define itself by its past, but committed to reimagining its future in a way that honored all its people. At the same time, immigration continued to reshape the Canadian demographic mosaic. Cities like Toronto, Vancouver, and Montreal became some of the most ethnically diverse in the world. Newcomers brought new languages, customs, and perspectives, enriching the cultural fabric of the nation and challenging it to live up to its multicultural promise. Debates over national values, integration, and identity surfaced. But so too did celebrations of pluralism, festivals, food music, and shared spaces, reflected a broader narrative. Canada was no longer merely a land of English and French, but a global meeting ground where diversity was not just tolerated, but embraced politically. Canada matured into a confident actor on the world stage. Peacekeeping, environmental advocacy, and humanitarian efforts became hallmarks of its foreign policy, though not without contradictions and criticisms. Canadian troops served in Afghanistan, participated in global climate summits, and took stances on international human rights issues, carving out a role distinct from both its colonial past and its powerful neighbor to the south. The journey of independence was now not just about sovereignty from Britain, but about asserting moral and political leadership. In a complex, interdependent world, domestically, new generations of Canadians began to question long-held assumptions about power history and identity. Indigenous youth reclaimed their languages and cultures. Young activists demanded climate justice. And equity movements led protests that challenged systemic barriers in education, employment, and policing. Political leaders were increasingly held accountable by a digitally connected public eager for transparency and change. The liberal ideals that had once defined the country's break from monarchy now had to be measured against new standards of justice, representation, and sustainability. The story of Canada's independence was no longer only about shedding colonial rule, but about building a society that reflected the highest aspirations of its people, from the earliest loyalists who clung to the crown through the constitutional visionaries who imagined a self-governing federation to the modern citizens who demanded inclusion and accountability. The arc of Canada's evolution had bent slowly but persistently toward freedom. Each generation had added its voice to the conversation. Each crisis had prompted reflection and reform, and each act of courage had helped shape a nation unafraid to confront its contradictions and celebrate its complexities. Canada's journey from loyalists to liberals was not an end, but a beginning, a living story still being written in the laws, institutions, dreams, and struggles of its people. It was a journey defined not by perfection, but by persistence, a testament to the power of dialogue, compromise, and vision in forging a country that continues to strive for a more just, inclusive, and sovereign future.